Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Just to say that you're on the right window, the ABIFI's webinar around Middle East war, the implication and outlook for global energy markets. So we'll be just starting in a couple of minutes just to allow all the attendees to be with us. Thank you. All right, I think we can start. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. And thanks again for joining us for this webinar. I know it's very busy and also very difficult times for everyone, particularly the colleagues in Lebanon, so who are joining us this afternoon as well. Um, we are delighted this afternoon to be organizing this webinar, and we look forward to this discussion in the second week of the Middle East war that was launched by the United States and Israel on Iran 2 weeks ago. So more than 2 weeks today into this war, the global energy markets are still living the repercussions and feeling unprecedented shockwaves into the markets. The International Energy Agency has recently framed what is ongoing as the biggest disruption to oil market flows in history or in recent history. And because since the start of the war, it wasn't only about flows, it was also about the transit via the Strait of Hormuz, which was a key choke point for oil supply, allowing 1/3 of oil trade globally and around 20% of liquefied natural gas that are delivered through the strait. So since the start of the war on February 28th, and although recent information that I'm sure our colleagues will be sharing today showed that more ships are passing through the strait compared to last week, but generally speaking, the passage and the transit is still extremely thin and almost inexistent. Since then, crude oil prices have been skyrocketing and have reached new highs around $100 per barrel, with increasing volatility in the markets. And not to mention also the increase in prices when it comes to commodities, particularly refined products around the world. And this has been exacerbated by increased attacks on oil and gas facilities, as well infrastructure, as well as attacks on vessels that we will try also to cover in this discussion. So to ease such disruptions, some countries have, particularly Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have been diverting some of their production through pipelines to bypass the strait. But others do not have, other countries within the strait, the region within the Strait of Hormuz, do not have this luxury and have been facing several challenges, both in terms of production, some of which have halted production over the past few days and also weeks, Some companies also have announced force majeure in the market. Qatar halted its LNG exports. So this gloomy environment has allowed maybe the energy global energy market to come back as a first on the agenda. And as a response to those supply disruptions, the IEA members last week have decided and announced the most or the biggest release of strategic oil reserves in the IEA's recent history of around 400 million barrels per from their strategic reserves. So with this environment, and also with taking into account that the future of the duration and the scale of this conflict is still highly uncertain, we aim through this discussion to tackle some of the medium and long-term implications of the conflict and of the war and the ongoing regional instabilities on global energy market, with particular interest on oil, LNG markets, and also the Strait of Hormuz and the shipping, what's happening these days into the shipping industry. And we are delighted at Ayoub to be welcoming some of our colleagues that have been, I know, very busy over the past weeks, and we thank them again for their time for this webinar. Glad to welcome Peter Stevenson, who is the East Med editor at MES, the Middle East Economic Survey. He has been covering the region for the last decade and is considered to be a reference when it comes to East Med gas. Also from Washington, I'm glad to welcome our colleague Noam Raydan. She is Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, focusing on energy and maritime risks in the Middle East. She is also, and for those of you who don't know, she has been the co-creator of a interactive map showing the maritime attacks happening in the MENA region since 2017, and she will be sharing some of that today with us on the webinar. And also, she is the publisher of the Choke Point. I personally invite everyone to subscribe to the newsletter because it explores all the issues related at the intersection of energy, shipping, and history in the Middle East. And last but not least, we are glad to welcome also one of our previous AUB colleagues, Bachar El-Halabi, who is an energy market and geopolitical analyst and correspondent with Arcus Media, based currently in Dubai. His work focuses on global energy markets, OPEC plus policy, and the geo-economic role of the Middle East energy infrastructure in global supply chains. His analysis also focuses on how energy markets, strategy, state strategy, and geopolitical competition interact to shape global power dynamics, international security, and economic stability. So his reporting and analysis examines the political economy of energy in the Middle East, with particular attention to the strategy decisions of major oil-producing countries and their implication for global markets. So thanks, everyone, and welcome for that. Let me start with you, Bachar. As I just said in the introduction, the IEA has framed the current supply crisis as the biggest disruption to oil market flows in history. So we might have seen over the past 2 weeks the short-term implications of the war, but maybe the biggest question mark here is, first question maybe, are those or our oil market today setting into a new norm as a result of the war, what we are seeing? What can you expect next? How much will it take for markets, if we assume that the war will end in a few weeks' time? How much will it take for oil markets to settle?
First of all, thank you so much, Marc, for the invite. Thank you for the Isam Faris Institute and to AUB for setting the panel up. And I wish it was happening in a different circumstances in general. If we look at the decision taken by the IEA, and if we take a step back and think about the IEA and the raison d'etre of the IEA, why was it established in general? The IEA was established in the 1970s, right after the major oil shock of 1973, which resulted in a huge spike in prices and had a direct impact on the global economy. Of course, this oil shock was related to also a different war in the Middle East, in the region, and it was related also to a decision that Saudi Arabia at the time took in order to try and mitigate the impact of that war, or to try and catalyze and put an end to that war in general. So the IEA was born, and its reason or purpose is to deal with shortages to the global economy and to global oil demand in cases of crises, exactly what we're going through now. As you mentioned, and as you cited the IEA saying, this is absolutely unprecedented. This is uncharted territory. We've previously, throughout decades, we've seen certain supply disruptions. We've seen certain conflicts impacting certain energy infrastructures, but that was tied perhaps to one country or two countries. We haven't seen this amount of oil and energy producing or oil and gas producing countries being impacted at once, and we haven't seen such levels of disruption in exports, most importantly, and also in production in general, as a result of the spillover of this war. So the IEA last week got together, officials at the IEA got together and decided to tap into their strategic reserves. They decided there is a deficiency in the market, there's a deficit in supply to the market, and they needed to release barrels from those storages in order to try and mitigate this deficit. What we're looking at the moment, and you gave the numbers already, a 20% supply to global demand comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. This comes from Iraq, Kuwait, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, in addition to Iran, primarily. What has happened over the past 3 weeks, and I'm sure Noam can go into the nitty-gritty details of this, is that tanker traffic through the strait has technically come to a halt. And the only tankers, up until very recently, the only tankers that were going through that strait were Iranian tankers. But also when it comes to Iran, Iran was not really exporting at pre-war levels. So we had two things: exports to the consumers around the world stopped from the Gulf countries, and also there has been a reduction in production from those countries over the past 3 weeks. You've mentioned force majeures in Qatar, in Kuwait, and also in Iraq. The Emiratis have reduced their production, their oil production, by almost 50% now, and the Saudis have decreased their production also by around 2.5 million barrels per day. So we're talking about a reduction also in production, similar to the COVID level shock that the globe went through. Back to the IEA decision, the IEA wants to fill this gap. Those 400 barrels, unfortunately, cannot hit the markets in one go. They need to be withdrawn from storages, they need to be loaded on tankers, and they needed to be sent to clients around the world, to consumers around the world. This process takes time, and this process has its capacity limitations. So from those 400 million barrels, estimates show that at best, there are 3 million barrels that can hit markets, and at worst, we can start with 1.5 million barrels. But this does not definitely meet the gap that we are witnessing now, which is now estimate as a back of the envelope calculation. We're meeting there's a disruption of around 10 million barrels per day from the Strait of Hormuz. One as production, and as supply to markets, it goes higher than that. So this is where we are. This is unprecedented for oil markets in general. We are still not. People have started to notice perhaps a bit of increase in gasoline prices in certain areas around the world, depending on how the pricing mechanism differs from one country to the other. But when we talk about an oil shock, when we talk about a price shock, it'll start hitting us in the next few weeks, as long as the disruption from the Strait of Hormuz is there. The conclusion that we have reached over the past 3 weeks is that the strait is not really just a passage or a choke point. The strait is actually one of the main arteries of the global economy, and oil continues to play a very important role in this global economy.
Thank you, Bachar. Very interesting. Maybe just a quick follow-up, maybe on from your analysis and also from your market insights on the medium to long term. Do you think that, let's say, just assuming if the war ends soon, how long the markets will need in terms of time to really settle down back. Can we expect, let's say, prices to drop down after the war, or this will be the new normal for the coming few months, let's say?
So, Mark, oil markets have been living through an extremely turbulent times over the past 6 years. Since COVID days, the fluctuation in prices has been also unprecedented. This is what I hear from officials. The algorithms are now, to an extent, also impacting oil prices, and the volatility is again unprecedented. I used to be, or I attend OPEC decisions, OPEC meetings in Vienna. There would be a decision for OPEC, for example, to cut production. And then the next morning, when markets open, there would be a decrease in prices rather than an increase. This is just a real life example of how turbulent markets are. Then enter this war. The real question is, on what terms does this war end? It's not about whether there is a ceasefire or not, because if we take again a step back and look, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz today is not happening through traditional means. People talk about mines and what have you, but I don't think those are really necessary. And I think Noam can go into that again. It's her area of expertise. But I think Iran, through the Houthi group, the Yemeni Houthi group, ran a trial phase on how to choke such routes, access points, maritime corridors in the Red Sea and around Bab el-Mandeb for almost 2 years. And they realized that all you need is perhaps drones in order to create enough sense of fear around the passing through those routes and passages. This is why now we see insurance is really high, and many insurers are not really subscribing to this. We see people wanting to avoid going through the Strait of Hormuz in general. So again, yes, the war can end today, and there will be a huge hangover effect, because we're talking about almost 3 weeks of disruption in both supply and in exports. But the terms on which the war ends will be extremely important moving forward. One last point is what has been mentioned yesterday by two UAE officials. There was first the presidential envoy, Anwar Gargash, who discussed the possibility of the UAE playing a role in escorting tankers and vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. But then also there's the comments made, and a very rare comments made by ADNOC CEO, the UAE's oil company, Sultan Al Jaber, who has been talking about this hangover and the aftershock that we will all feel in everyday life and in all aspects of our lives, given this, as long as this war is raging. And even if it ends now, there will be a hangover effect. We can discuss this later.
Thank you, Bachar. I'll come back to you, particularly when it comes to OPEC Plus also position. Now I'm moving back, maybe moving to you. Like, you've been closely following, as I said in the introduction, the latest attacks happening on vessels in the Red Sea previously, but now also in the Strait of Hormuz. So maybe if you can give us a bit of an update or an idea of what's the current status of the strait today, who can pass through the strait, and maybe a subsequent question is, what does this disruption tell us about this the resilience of the system in terms of moving oil flows through choke points, through straits? What will that tell us for the future?
Hi, Mark. Hi, everyone. And thank you very much, Mark, for inviting me. As you noted at the beginning, at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, we've been closely monitoring the maritime domain, specifically in the Middle East, for several years now. I'm going to share in a bit with you just a map to show you how the maritime domain is in the heart of any conflict that takes place in the MENA region. And we've seen state and non-state actors using the maritime domain over the past several years, mainly Iran and the Houthis in Yemen, how they've been using it in order to disrupt shipping or just to put pressure on their adversaries. So give me a moment to share my screen. So what you see here is the map itself. You have over 300 incidents and attacks in the MENA region since 2017. Probably you see them as small dots, but you're talking about really a lot of attacks here. Forget the Mediterranean, because here we have some ship attacks related to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I'm going to move a little bit to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and I'm going to go immediately to now where we are. This is mainly where we are right now. These are the attacks so far we've seen Iran carrying out. These also include incidents that we haven't verified at this time, meaning we don't know the exact target, but we can see that so far Iran has carried, I'm talking about the beginning, since the beginning of the war, has carried out around 20 incidents, attacks, and these also involved, as I said, incidents where we don't know the exact target. Mainly, they've focused on bulk carriers, container ships, and also they've targeted oil tankers. But what's interesting, we've been studying the trend here, or the pattern, is that there isn't really a clear pattern about what they're doing exactly. We don't see an organized maritime campaign yet against shipping, similar to the way the Houthis were behaving in the past several years in the Red Sea, and which the Houthis portrayed as part of the retaliation against Israel because of the Gaza war. So what we're seeing right now here is an Iranian, definitely an Iranian attempt to disrupt shipping. But when it comes to the attacks, we really aren't seeing yet an escalation. But Iran doesn't really need to escalate further at this point in order to disrupt the oil flows and the flow of commodities in general from the Strait of Hormuz. It's enough for them to just show that they can attack here, as you can see my cursor, attack in Basra, attack of the UAE here, even reach Gulf of Oman here, of Muscat, and also in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. Over the past several years, I just want to show you what Iran was doing. If we go back, over the past several years, Iran was using the maritime domain to harass shipping, just using a helicopter to board a ship, or even just sending, let's say, a skiff, a small boat to harass shipping. Right now, what they're doing is they're trying to expand the maritime campaign to something probably later on similar to the Houthis, as you can see here. All these attacks you see here were carried by the Houthis over the past several years. What the Houthis managed to do was cause logistical disruption. They didn't cause disruption in supply. So ships that couldn't move through Bab el-Mandeb, they were actually moving here around the Cape of Good Hope, as you can see, around Africa. Iran, in my opinion, is still in the second phase of the maritime campaign. We should expect them to escalate, similar to what the Houthis did here in Bab el-Mandeb. I hope that the map is helpful to just show you exactly what I'm talking about. The Houthis divide the maritime campaign over at least 5 phases. In my opinion, and this is, I'm still studying what Iran is doing, I believe Iran is still in stage 2 of their maritime campaign. They will probably resort to more attacks, more planned attacks, depending on how Israel and the US also escalate in the energy domain specifically, because today we saw that an Iranian energy asset was targeted, and I definitely expect Iran to retaliate in the energy domain and the maritime domain. But this is when it comes to how they are behaving right now in the maritime domain. I mean, the Iranians, I still haven't seen them really using a lot of sophisticated tools to go after ships. And we should expect them at a later stage, again, depending on the trajectory of the war, depending on how Iran's own energy infrastructure is affected. We should expect Iran to further escalate. And they cannot only escalate here in the Persian Gulf, they can escalate in the Strait of Hormuz, Gulf of Aden, and even here. These points that you see here, these took place over the past years. Iran can just use a drone in order to hit a ship, probably a ship linked to Israel. And they did it in the past years because they had also what we call the shadow war over the past several years with Israel. They were attacking Israeli ships here. I'm talking about the period like between 2019 and up until early 2023 before the Gaza war. So Iran has a lot of experience in using the maritime campaign, a maritime domain, in order as a theater of operation in any conflict. The Houthis succeeded very well. And up until now, even if the Houthis are not doing anything, they've established themselves as a threat to be reckoned with. And this is why a lot of people that talk to me ask me this question: are the Houthis going to enter the conflict anytime soon? For me, they don't have to do anything right now. already their silence probably is a strategic tool. Now, back to the main question: how has all this affected? If you want, I can stop sharing. How has
What's happening today,
yeah.
by the way?
What's happening? What's
Yeah, what's
happening
happening?
today? So the disruption has severely prevented commercial vessels in general from passing through the Strait of Hormuz. We are seeing very few vessels, and this is based on my tracking, also based on me talking to different sources and colleagues in the industry itself. Let me mention a few key points. Ships linked to Iran are passing. Oil carried on Iran-linked ships bound for China are passing. What's so funny is that several ships, we can immediately tell that they are linked to Iran based on their flag because they are part of the shadow fleet, and we can immediately tell like if that flag is linked to a ship that is sanctioned due to its trade in Iranian oil. On top of that, as I said, Iran is in phase two right now, right? When it comes to how they're using the maritime domain, Iran is deciding who will pass. We started gradually seeing that some countries like India and even Pakistan, and earlier this week also Iraq, kind of establishing some talks with Iran in order to allow some of the ships to pass. India is very vulnerable. When it comes to liquefied petroleum gas, they import around 80% of their needs. And the Middle East is a very key area for them. And this is why, based on my observation, I'm even seeing at least 3 tankers right now linked to India, signaling on their AIS that they're either India linked or linked to the government or carrying an Indian cargo. I expect these to pass. But again, Iran is treating the Strait of Hormuz as a valve, a tap, and they control it. So we are seeing again very few vessels that are passing, and Iran is going to continue controlling the strait. It is its strongest card right now, and probably we're going to see Iran dividing or starting a new phase in its maritime campaign, either to escalate or probably allow more ships to pass. But given the latest news today that its own energy assets were targeted, I definitely expect Iran to escalate in the maritime domain and, of course, in the energy domain. I'll leave it at that. Happy to take any follow-up questions, Marc.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. Of course, I have like some follow-up questions, but I'll leave them maybe to after for the second round. Peter, maybe moving to natural gas or particularly liquefied natural gas. So with Qatar halting production since almost day one of the war, announcing force majeure, and then we know that the Ras Laffan, they intercepted a drone during the first days of the war. So we expect currently around 110 billion cubic meters of LNG per year that have been going through the strait in 2025 that are now halted through the Strait of Hormuz, which is 20%, as we said earlier, of LNG trade in 2025. So can you give us a bit of an update of what's the LNG situation currently in the region? And maybe looking, and of course, I know your expertise and focus on the importers. How are importers reacting to this disruption in LNG, and how they will react to that in the future moving on?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Marc, and thank you to the Institute and Ayoub for having me on. I mean, I would say, just like the oil dynamics, that the minute that you take a large amount of supply off of the market, you inevitably see price fluctuations and people scrambling for supplies. So broader scale, I mean, if we look wider picture globally, we're seeing a lot of Asian countries which are, largely dependent on LNG for power, that they're switching out LNG, the natural gas for other fuels, so that they're switching to coal. Closer to home, we have Egypt as well, which is still importing LNG. It's managing to find some some sources of LNG to import, but it's also having to switch to fuel oil for power. So we're seeing a lot of these dynamics within the industry itself. The more that countries enact fuel switching, the more it eases the supply issues. And of course, it goes without saying that, and even for oil and for gas, for everything really, the longer the conflict carries on, the more cracks will begin to appear within the markets, within each country's own strategic reserves and their own contingency plans. So if we just look at overall at the LNG market, currently there is little to no spare capacity. So that's why we have this big kind of shock and countries moving to fuel switching. The only relief will come from new projects, and those are mainly in the US, and those are coming online gradually. So a lot of the countries are trying to get their hands on US LNG. So in the short term, and to coin a phrase from my colleague James Marriott, he said there's going to be a knife fight over flexible cargoes. So this will be primarily between Asian and European buyers looking for US cargoes. Longer term, you have countries that have modeled their energy security on LNG might have to, reconsider that strategy if there's going to be a crisis every few years where LNG will be taken off the market. Maybe they might need to look for other energy sources. So you might see countries switching their focus to renewables or potentially backup coal units. I mean, Israel itself has looked at keeping its coal units online. So you have those dynamics. And yes, so the length of the disruptions is the most important factor here for the scale of the impact and change in buyer strategy. So if the conflict were to resolve itself soon, you might not see so much scrambling by countries to maybe look to create contingency plans. I mean, just a case in point here is Egypt itself, which, last year suffered outages during the 12-day Israel-Iran war when flows from Israel stopped. And again, it's been the case now, but it's managed to put those contingency measures in place. So it has 4 floating storage and regasification units all operating and importing LNG. Although, of course, the problem now is, tight market, where to get the LNG. Prices have spiked. I mean, we're seeing maybe prices of around $10 per million BTU for LNG prior to the conflict, and they've doubled at some stage. I think they've come down slightly since, but you have these various dynamics. I think the one thing that helps the current situation, at least in the Middle East, in our region, is that it's still quite mild, the weather, so we're not seeing that high demand summer season where gas is highly sought after. So right now the demand hasn't spiked, but if the conflict does carry on into the summer, then you will start seeing more cracks, and that's when more problems will start to appear.
I'll come back in the discussion to you to ask you about Israel, Egypt, Jordan, because now like the focus is more on the Qatari LNG, particularly because of the Strait of Hormuz, but we are forgetting what's happening also, that Israel halted production from the first few days of the war in Leviathan and Karish, and maybe try to compare that with what happened during the war in Gaza. But maybe a follow-up on that. Assuming the war ends, I mean, sometime soon, assuming that scenario, do you think that the halting production or the force majeure announced by LNG producers in the area will have long-term repercussions in the market, particularly like maybe in a more like there was sort of trust in the market with Qatari LNG that this is the most trusted source and we can sign long-term contracts with Qatar without really worrying a lot about, I mean, the supply, etc. Now, what happened is sort of a supply shock, particularly. So this will have eventually an impact on the long term. If Asian players will need to sign new contracts, this will be taken into account. Do you think that it's still manageable for the time being, or it is starting to have repercussions at this stage?
Look, I think definitely it's going to spook a lot of LNG importers, and especially Asian countries who look to Qatar for, a lot of their baseload volumes that they import, and it had been a very trustworthy supplier of LNG, and inevitably the spotlight now falls upon that trustworthiness. And again, as you said, the longer this goes on, the bigger the question arises: can we trust this source? So inevitably, they will look to diversify their sources of LNG more, and potentially look to changing their sources of energy to fuel energy fuels, and diversifying their fuel mix to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. But again, it's the bottom line is how the length of this conflict. The longer it goes on, the more it spooks, the more it raises questions, and the more cracks will begin to appear.
Thanks, Peter. We'll continue the discussion on the East Med in particular. I would invite also, like at this stage, our attendees also to, if they have any questions, any thoughts, there's the Q&A box on Zoom here. They can put in the questions, and I'll try at the end to cover some of those if time allows. Bachar, coming back to you, you've touched upon OPEC Plus just in your intervention. We know that on March 1st, there was it was non-related to the war, but there was a meeting, an OPEC Plus meeting, and they announced an increase in production of around 200,000 barrels per day. And this includes OPEC Plus, includes some of the OPEC members, the Gulf producers, but also the Russia and other players. So, I mean, after the IEA announcement, this went, into the wind, and we didn't really hear back about the impact. It didn't have any impact, or it didn't live much. What do you think? About, your thoughts on the OPEC Plus situation and position currently after the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, and how do you think national oil companies in the region and the Gulf particularly are dealing with the situation, or will be dealing with the situation moving forward?
Thank you, Marc. Sorry. So, OPEC Plus is. Can you see me? Okay. So OPEC Plus is an alliance between oil-producing countries. You have the Middle East oil-producing countries. You have also Libya, Algeria. You have also Venezuela, and then there's another major or swing producer, which is Russia, attached to it, Kazakhstan and other countries. This group. Was the main idea behind forming OPEC Plus like 6 or 7 years ago, was first and foremost, it came to life between Saudi Arabia and Russia. The United States production capacity was growing. The United States was on full throttle. The shale industry was receiving a lot of investments. Prices were optimum, and production was growing. And the US was taking on both Saudi Arabia and Russia, and becoming the largest single oil producer in the world. They needed to join forces because at the end of the day, oil is not just about oil. Oil is about politics, and this is why we have geopolitics. But what they've tried to do since OPEC Plus was created was to manage markets, and this is something that they often say. Yes, they do. They would never admit this in public, but prices definitely do matter to OPEC Plus members, because at the end of the day, they have budgets, they have diversification plans, they need to develop their countries and the infrastructure and what have you. But what their main intention, or one of their main targets, is to manage supply as a result of where demand stands. And we've seen this role come to life or to fruition during the COVID era. Obviously, this came at a huge price because there was a fallout between Saudi Arabia and Russia because they could not initially agree, and Saudi Arabia had to technically open the taps and flood the markets with oil. But they came since then. They've learned from that trauma and they've decided to manage markets. Now, what has been happening over the past 2 years is that the cuts that OPEC Plus took right after COVID, where they reduced production in general, and they were trying to bring back those cuts to the market because they realized at an elevated price, we were talking about $90 per barrel or $80 per barrel as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they were losing market share to the shale industry and to non-OPEC Plus producers like Canada, Brazil, and Guyana as well, who's a growing, or a newbie on the block, but it has a growing capacity. And they've managed to do that. But this always depended on their ability to produce or their ability to cut production. This is the main lever of power that OPEC Plus has, which, for example, the United States does not have. In OPEC Plus countries, production of oil is centralized. The government controls that. There's a policy, there's an energy ministry, there's an oil company, and there's a chain of command, which eventually leads to, okay, guys, we need to cut production by that, or we need to ramp up production by that. In the US, we're talking about private sector. So the US government cannot really dictate terms on investors or on companies and private companies in general. The problem that OPEC Plus is facing now, and it's a huge problem, and this is why I smiled when you mentioned the March 1st meeting, is that they are unable to produce at will, and they are unable to export at will. And this is something that's gonna, in a way, damage OPEC Plus's standing for now as a result of this war. Because at the end of the day, and this also translates to gas, and which Peter has touched on in his conversation, the most important thing as a producer is your reliability and sustainability, your ability to honor your deals with your consumers, and your ability to remain reliable and to send those oil and gas to your consumers. This is what keeps you afloat. This is what ensures this trust. And this is why other countries, and this is why FDIs come to your country in order to invest in your energy infrastructure. This has been hit. And this is an Achilles heel for the countries in the region, all of them except the UAE to an extent, because their economies continue to primarily depend and largely depend on the revenues from hydrocarbons. Even with Qatar, for example, even with Saudi Arabia, even with Kuwait and Iraq is a different story. I mean, it's a terrible situation over there. So as a result of the disruption through Hormuz. So they're taking a hit now. How will they recover from this? I personally don't know, but I can tell you from my conversations with energy officials around the region, they've already lived through previous traumas, one of which is the tanker war in the 80s, the Iraq invasion, ISIS taking over large swaths of land in Iraq, disrupting production, and what have you. And every single time they've learned from those mistakes, and they've invested in mitigation plans in order to avoid such scenarios. But now they're faced with the worst case scenario. So this takes us back to the main question. How will this war end? On what terms will this war end? Because if markets, if we reach a ceasefire now today, right? And markets know that whatever is left of the Iranian regime, whatever is left of the IRGC chain of command is there, and the ability to disrupt logistics, as Noam mentioned, through the Strait of Hormuz is persistent, then those countries are the Gulf countries, the oil and gas producing countries, are going to be the biggest losers of this war. Of course, Iran has its own problems to deal with in terms of the attacks it has suffered from, and also the damage it has caused as well. But at the end of the day, those countries have taken a completely different path than Iran in the past 40 to 50 years. What we see in Iran is a revolutionary regime who mostly invested in the the show that we're technically seeing nowadays, the missiles, the drones, the nuclear enrichment, and all of these things. While those Gulf countries over the past 30 to 40 years have invested in their diversification of their economies, they invested in turning, for example, the Gulf into one of the financial centers of the world, one of the travel hubs of the world, one of the port hubs, etc., etc. So this is where things currently stand. The Gulf countries are. This is why we're also seeing like leaks in media over the past 2-3 days. Allegedly reporting that Gulf officials are pushing the United States technically to ensure that the Iranian regime cannot persist or cannot continue cannot continue with this aggression towards those Gulf countries per se, and ensure that the safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz is there. They are also one last point. As a result of the tanker war of the 1980s, the Saudis invested in what is now called the East-West Pipeline. This East-West Pipeline has a nameplate export capacity of 7 million barrels of oil per day. This is massive, and it's the Saudi crown jewel. It moves oil from east to west, and it bypasses the Strait of Hormuz, and it has come in handy, although they've invested in it over 30, 40 years ago with a lot of, and invested in a lot of money. What other countries, especially deep-pocketed countries like Qatar, like the UAE, and Kuwait, perhaps, what they're going to be thinking about now is what can we do in order to ensure we bypass the Strait of Hormuz in general, no matter what regime is there in Iran. Because at the end of the day, this situation, this precedent has happened, and it gives ideas perhaps to maybe other regimes that can come in the future. I don't know. So what I know is that the Emiratis are clearly thinking about a pipeline with a larger capacity that bypasses Hormuz, not the current pipeline that can only carry between 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day. Kuwait would have to think differently, and Qatar as well will have to think perhaps along the lines of the Saudi East-West Pipeline. So, and this will require a lot of money, a lot of investments, and a lot of time. But there is the future of those countries at stake, and they don't want to lose their customers, as Peter mentioned in his intervention. So this is where things currently stand.
Thank you, Bashar. Maybe you mentioned Iraq, and I think it is worth maybe focusing a bit on that. I'll go with Noam on that first, and then maybe hear back from you, Bashar, on that. So, although Gulf countries are impacted from what's happening and the closure, we feel, or it's not a feeling, it's a fact that Iraq will be or is the most impacted country from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz because it didn't invest over the past decades in alternative routes, in pipelines, and it only has the export facilities in Basra. So now I'm knowing your expertise on Iraq, and I know you've been following, and maybe until yesterday, we've been hearing that rhetoric, and I think it is still one of the most impacted countries. So yesterday, we heard about a new US mediation that allowed the reopening or restart of the Kirkuk Shihan pipeline going into Turkey, into the Middle East. And that was after a few weeks of a political deadlock between the central government of Iraq and the Kurdish government as well in Kurdistan. So with the absence of alternatives for Iraq, what do you think the restart of the exports through the Turkey pipeline be helpful? And what are the lessons for Iraq for the future as well, based on this experience?
What a question, Mark. First of all, Iraq is a country I lived there for several years. I worked there, and I wasn't surprised at all with what happened to Iraq. I wasn't. Since last year, I would like just a little bit of just a few more remarks, and I'll move to your questions. Last year, we were really watching closely here in Washington the talks between Iraqis, including Baghdad, and the Kurdish officials from Kurdistan and Washington I was talking to a lot of officials, and it was great that they managed, at the end, towards the end of last year, to reopen a pipeline that had been shut down for over 2 years. And that was an achievement, but still we were very careful about our optimism. Again, because of political bickering, historical disagreements between the both sides, Baghdad and Kurdistan, which will take a long time to be ironed out. And what we will continue seeing are only temporary solutions. We should always expect in Iraq disruptions, sadly, especially from the north, as long as several issues related, one, to politics, related to managing, let's say, trade throughout Kurdistan are not settled. On top of other issues related to, in general, to how Iraq wants to manage its overall oil wealth and as well as gas well. So I wanted to note that. And also, before the Iran war, and I highlighted this a lot in work that I did, that U.S. achieved, and this is my opinion, achieved progress in Iraq in the energy domain. We were expecting this summer Accelerate Energy, right, to send an FSRU to Iraq. It is right now still in Asia. It was built and it started its trial. But given the war right now, we really don't know what's going to happen to that project. On top of that, we were seeing major U.S. At least two U.S. oil majors thinking about returning to Iraq, but this was, of course, related to reviewing contracts, which is a main issue, and not, as a lot of people said, the security issue in Iraq. So those majors were willing to return. Security was not. A lot of people say security was the issue. It was not. It was mainly related to the contracts because they wanted to ensure that there will be a stream of revenues, the IOCs, I mean. Now, what's happening is it's just completely does not align, right, with what we were seeing or what we were calling for, and also trying, to help both sides do, Kurdistan and Baghdad. Now we have very severe disruption in Iraq. From Basra, Iraq had to curtail or shut down, in other words, a little bit over 3 million barrels per day from Basra. Why? Because Iraq relies on the Strait of Hormuz to export the Basra grade. Without it, they cannot do anything. Iran last week, they attacked at least 2 tankers in Basra, and that triggered a shutdown in the oil terminals. So what's going on right now? Iraq wants to at least export from the north. I want to clarify that what we saw yesterday is still mainly related to federally controlled oil fields, Kirkuk. The KRG output had to be shut down because of attacks by Iran-aligned militias and due to the security situation in general. And the IOCs in northern Iraq have been facing these security threats since last year and even before. But since last year, we've been seeing a lot of harassment being done towards the IOCs. What was done is the following. Because Baghdad cannot export from the south, and it relies on it for oil revenues for its budget, again, 90% of the budget comes from oil revenues. They have to try at least to export what they can from the north using the Kirkuk oil field. When the agreement was done late last year to resume the flows via the pipeline in the north to Shayhan, again, the crude was KRG produced. It wasn't Kirkuk. Now what's happening, Iraq wants to use a pipeline that passes through Kurdistan, connects to the pipeline to Shayhan in order to move some barrels that are labeled as Kirkuk. Will this help? Absolutely, it's not a replacement for Basra. Absolutely, it's not a replacement for revenues. To put it in context, export from the south, Basra, they bring probably around $5 to $6 billion for Iraq. From the north, we're going to have less than $1 billion, probably around $500 million, and that's it. But right now, it's important, at least for Iraq, to continue having some revenues, especially because they have a lot of salaries to pay. And this is a major problem, not a surprise. We saw it during COVID. Back then, it was different. We didn't see the disruptions we're seeing right now. Iraq is in a completely different terrain. I really cannot see any positive outcome right now, especially if the war continues, the strait is not opened, Iran decides to escalate, and even go against energy targets, not only in the Gulf states, even in Iraq. Iran is willing even to go after energy assets in Iraq. They just don't care, knowing Iraq's vulnerability. On top of that, I just want to add something. The focus right now is on oil in Iraq. We need to talk about gas from Iran. Anything that happens to the gas production in Iran is going to also affect Iraq. And Iraq also relies on Iran for piped natural gas. And the US was trying over the past years to wean Iraq off Iran, right? But right now, Iraq is in a very difficult situation. So because we don't know what's going to happen to that project by the US firm, Accelerate Energy, this is probably off the table right now, given the situation. We don't know also if Iraq will find it very difficult to continue the pipe gas from Iran. But right now, Iraq is in a very difficult situation. They need the Iranian gas. They need to talk to the Iranians in order to let their own tankers pass through the Strait of Hormuz, just like a few other countries. Lastly, a lot of people keep asking me why Iraq didn't think about pipelines in the past. It's a very easy question to ask, but Iraq, since Saddam Hussein's years, we're talking about that pipeline from Basra to Haditha to Aqaba in Jordan. It never materialized. Even during COVID, they started talking about it, although the economics were very poor because of the drop in oil prices back then. This pipeline faced a lot of security, economic, and political challenges. And if they try to bring it up again right now, I'm a person who will immediately ignore it, because this is not the right time to talk about building pipelines. It just doesn't make sense. Pipelines cannot be built overnight. Even if they come up again, decide to build a pipeline to Aqaba, it will only probably export 1 million barrels per day. This is probably one Suezmax that can leave through Jordan up to the Mediterranean. This is Iraq's situation. Not very good, as you can tell, Marc. And I'll leave it at that.
Interesting as well, yeah. Maybe Bashar, if you have any follow-up on that. I know you've written over the past few days about like the Iraqi case in particular, and we've been hearing as well, like just to complement the last point of Noam on this, and not only the Aqaba idea of a new pipeline, but there are talks now to revive the pipeline to Syria, to Banyas, and also to build a new one. Like, any thoughts also on the Iraqi case? Maybe I think you frame it in terms of lack of planning, but also the political deadlock that caused all of this. So yeah, your thoughts on that.
I stayed polite on Twitter by dissecting the Iraqi situation, but given we're talking on a Lebanese platform, Lebanese American platform, in order to draw some comparison, the political situation in Iraq is to an extent similar to the political situation in Lebanon, and politics tend to dictate most of government spending, and also you have corruption, you have sectarianism, and all of that. So when it came to the Aqaba pipeline, that was revamped or resuscitated as an idea under the former government of Mustafa al-Kadhimi. But there were two problems. The first problem is a political. I'll come back to it. The second one was financial. Oil prices. Iraq, basically, we were coming out of, or we were going through COVID, and oil prices weren't optimum. Iraq did not have any wiggle room in order to invest in projects. There's that. But more importantly, there's the political element. There's the Iranian dominance to an extent over politics in Baghdad, and there are the Iranian aligned factions within the Iraqi parliament and the Iranian aligned militias who actually openly threatened the government that if you want to move forward with this pipeline, we're ready to blow it up. We're talking about Iraqis saying they're ready to blow up this pipeline. So this is the problem with Iraq in general, and the problem with the Aqaba pipeline. Going to Syria, there is obviously the Banyas, the pipeline that goes to Banyas. Previously, under the Assad regime, there was a civil war in Syria, and the situation was not optimum. The pipeline had been heavily damaged, and no one wanted to invest in that. But then the regime changed. And just to go in a tangent here and talk a bit of politics, a bit more politics, the regime comes from a Sunni fundamental background. And then in Iraq, you have Iran-aligned militias that have a Shia fundamental background. So there was a lot of tension between the two countries at the start, especially when the regime in Syria was trying to stabilize. And the Sudani government, the government of Prime Minister Hamad Shia Sudani, thought about the pipeline for two reasons. One is because they need another export route, and and this is based on conversations I've had with oil ministry officials. They were terrified from the June war. They knew that another round is coming, but they couldn't do much about planning and finding other solutions because of the political deadlock in the country. So there's that. And then the Sudani government found it as a good idea to engage Damascus over this pipeline in order to ensure stability on borders, in order to ensure that, if you want, militia groups from both sides of the border look inwards rather than look towards the other. So there's that. There are obviously other outlets for Iraq to invest in. There's the Jihan pipeline, which constitutes of a network of pipelines. So its capacity can be raised, but this also has a political bump in the road, if you want, which is Turkey. Turkey has cancelled the agreement that binds Turkey and Iraq over the usage of this pipeline, over the volumes that needs to be exported through this pipeline, over tariffs, of everything, all of everything. This agreement ends this summer, and they were in the process of renegotiating the agreement. Turkey wants discounted oil, and they want higher volumes to come out of Iraq. So, and this requires a new government in Iraq, which is we're dealing with a caretaker government, and it requires a consensus between the different Iraqi factions in order to come to such an agreement, because unfortunately everyone wants a piece of the pie.
It's currently existing, I think, at the moment with everything happening. Thanks, Bashar. On coming back to gas, Peter, if we want to focus just, and again, I urge all the participants, if they have any, I can see some questions in the Q&A, but if there are any additional, please feel free to put the questions in. Focusing on Israeli gas and also the impact on Egypt and Jordan in particular. So Leviathan and Karish halted production, the two fields in Israel, the second day of the war. You've mentioned in your first intervention about maybe those countries, Egypt and Jordan, moving back again to diesel or fuel for electricity generation. And maybe one positive note is that we are still currently not in the high demand area, but maybe assuming this, let's say, period of buffer of, let's say, a month or two would help them maybe in the short term. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about what these countries are doing or will face in terms of if the impact is prolonged, the impact of no Israeli gas, and also if you want to compare this, what's happening with what happened during the Gaza war, let's say the 12 days last year or previously during the Gaza war, what did those countries do maybe to be more flexible in terms of supply?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very sort of similar conversation to the one that you've been having about Iraq and Banias and the Aqaba pipeline. Any conflict will sharpen everyone's focus to, we need to figure out a way that we're not going to be affected by the current issues that are at hand. And then once the conflict passes, everyone's like, "Oh, it's all right. We'll leave it. Just kick the can down the road, and we'll deal with it the next time." Or the politicians will say to each other, "It'll be someone else in charge, and he'll have to deal with it, and we can criticize him from across the bench." So you have that kind of situation. But to Egypt's credit, I think they could see their overdependence on Israeli gas and their own shrinking gas production, that something really needed to be done to make sure that if gas from Israel was stopped for whatever reason, whether that's conflict, whether that's maintenance, whether that's a fallout between the two governments, even though I think the US would never let that happen. I think they made the right moves. They secured 4 floating storage and regasification units, one at Damietta on the Mediterranean, so they could essentially avoid having to send any vessels through the Suez Canal, and then 3 other vessels at Ain Sokhna on the Red Sea. So, and then to that, they've also subchartered an FSRU for Jordan to help Jordan with its own gas demand as well. If again supplies from Israel are stopped, so for Jordan the formula is a little bit more complex, I'd say, because they import Leviathan gas from northern Israel, northern Jordan through the Arab gas pipeline. Some volumes are redirected and go north into Syria, but just don't tell the Syrians that they're getting Israeli gas. And then the rest of it flows down into the Jordanian system. And then you also have the FSRU, which has been active this year. Kepler data shows that Jordan's imported 2 cargoes in March so far. So not that that's particularly unusual. They did import a couple of cargoes last year during this period. So it's not completely, we're not outside the realms of normal kind of activity for that, but it does have those kind of contingencies in place. The only problem is for Jordan, as much as it is for Egypt, with both countries aren't particularly strong financially. You have that issue, especially with LNG prices spiking. So I think the one thing that the Egyptians didn't counter was Qatar stopping production. That threw a wrench in the works. So they've had to contend with increased spot prices, less LNG on the market. So while they have adapted to any potential kind of fall in volumes from Israel, which they saw happening last year. So what happens in those countries typically is, for obvious reasons, gas is rerouted to power mainly, and then industry kind of suffers because obviously having a popular uprising isn't ideal when you're in the Middle East. So anywhere really, I think a popular uprising isn't very good news. But yes, the Egyptians don't want to cause blackouts and have people on the streets. Famously had a previous government overthrown, so they prioritize that. For now, like you said, we're having quite a mild weather in the region. I think you're not here right now, but it's quite mild.
It's gonna, I mean, in the summer, of course, if the
Yeah,
things continue,
of
it
course,
will be.
things will get very tight. Egypt has the ability to switch to fuel oil, but the problem there again, prices are going up, demand is tighter. So it's about what it can get its hands on, at what price, at what contract, with what kind of relaxations potentially. That's how they've been working with the LNG. They've signed some term contracts with traders. They've signed some term contracts with Qatar Energy. They had signed as well, I believe. And but yeah, now they're having to look at the spot market, and the spot market is currently being squeezed. We'll see some volumes in the US potentially come online and help. But again, kind of circling back to what I had initially said, I think Asian countries as well will play a big role here about how much they will switch do some fuel switching, and whether they, lean on particular nuclear, maybe in Japan's case, coal, fuel oil, other alternative energies, how much that will offset. So yeah, if the war continues into the summer, I think the Egyptians will struggle, but I don't think they'll be the only ones. I think that there's going to be plenty of people that are going to be struggling. So I didn't mean to laugh, but yeah.
Essentially, I suppose it will come at a very high cost on both Jordan and Egypt if they want to keep the lights on
Of
and
course.
industries going and yeah. I have a question from the audience, I think, and I'm not sure if Bashar or Noam would like to maybe tackle that. But there's a question from Amal, I think, that the situation of the war have overlooked the concept of economic interdependence in terms of just a war on Iran maybe has its repercussions on all the region and the worldwide economy. So to what extent this will provide an excuse, and I think we covered that in the discussion, saying that some countries are moving or shifting again to coal, to diesel, to fuel, etc. So the question is to what extent this will provide an excuse to the, I think it's the drill concept, drill baby drill concept, forget the threat to climate and more importantly, impact on poorer countries. I'm not sure if Bashar would like to take that.
Thank you. Marc, I've been following COP summits for 4 years now, and I've attended the negotiations. I have an idea about how the environment has shifted precisely over the past year or two. Under the Biden administration, hope was running high. We were talking, or the world was talking about higher climate ambitions. Even those ambitions and pledges were going even higher. European countries wanted to push third world countries or global south or underdeveloped countries, name it, whatever you want. They wanted to push them to switch directly from hydrocarbons to renewable energy. And they were defining their aid and support to those countries on this matter, like defining development aid on the issue of climate. Out goes Joe Biden and his team, and then Trump comes in, and this completely was wiped off of the negotiation table. The U.S. was not there at the previous COP in Brazil, COP 30. There was a big problem in terms of reaching a final declaration by the COP summit and what have you. So we are currently, this crisis, this energy crisis is happening in a global atmosphere where we already see Europeans, we see the United States, and we see many other countries walking back on their climate ambition. Had it been under a different administration, it would have been a different story. But now the capability or the flexibility to switch, even if they want to switch back to coal for a country like India, or if they want to double down on the usage of coal like India and China, they're not going to face massive backlash on this matter. But the question now is here. So what will the developed and rich countries do moving forward? Are they going to double down on the energy transition agenda, despite how expensive it still is at the moment, and despite how difficult its scalability is at this moment? Because at the end of the day, the world is not compartmentalized. So if you have China emitting pollutants, methane gas, etc., and you're in Norway, it doesn't mean that you're immune from that, right? We all live under one ozone layer. So there will be a problem. It depends. Are those countries going to invest more in their energy transition, or they're going to adopt more flexible policies in order to continue the reliance on cheaper energy sources like oil and gas and coal, in order to mitigate the crisis that the financial crisis that we will be facing and are facing already to an extent. Inflation is still relatively high. We still are in the aftershock of the COVID in terms of the global economy, and this is why this will only compound the problem, the oil shock that we're facing now, the energy problem or crisis will compound the financial and the economic situation we've been dealing with for the past few years.
Absolutely. Maybe one closing note from each, and maybe just that's a random. I've been thinking about that. If the current war and the current disruptions we are witnessing have caused so much uncertainties, have caused so much instabilities in global markets and global energy supply. I want just maybe in a 30 seconds or 1 minute from each one of you as a closing. I'm not sure how positive we can be, but can we expect, and I'll start with Noam on that because you've mentioned the Houthis as well, and that's a point maybe we didn't really focus on. You've said that if the like the Houthis do not need to do anything for now because but can we expect or do you expect a worst case scenario from the one happening now? And if yes, what is that? Maybe just quickly in that's what we are living. Is there a more or a worst case scenario that we can expect on energy markets?
Given that we are in uncharted territory right now, Mark, we should expect that. When it comes to the Houthis, I would very much continue watching what's happening inside Iran. If Iran comes under further pressure, more of its energy assets are targeted. Right now, the Houthis might be activated. Right now, Iran does not need the Houthis. Even their silence is very strategic. They're just still projecting power by saying that the threat is still there. And this is why we still see a lot of shipping companies still unwilling to return, specifically in light of the situation in the Persian Gulf. So the Houthis definitely can enter, but it's going to depend, one, on the trajectory of the war, the pressure on Iran, and even the Houthis' willingness to sustain economic pain, because a lot they will be struck by Israel and US. So a lot of things are at play here, but I will definitely keep my eye on it. If that happens, again, the Saudi pipeline, the east to west, absolutely, it's a source of strength for Saudi Arabia. It is a source of vulnerability. So we need to keep that in mind. The tankers that are now loading in Yanbu, going to the south via Bab el-Mandeb to Asia, these, if the Houthis want to put also economic pressure, they can target this choke point. And you can imagine the shockwaves on global energy markets. I'll leave it at that.
Sure.
I'll go out on a limb here and say we might be entering the climax of the war with the assassinations that have been happening in the past 24 hours, and with today's Israel targeting Iranian energy infrastructure, and Iran now issuing threats and warnings that it will target energy infrastructure in the Gulf. This is the worst case scenario. This is I mean, we couldn't have imagined anything worse than that. So how does this play out? Whether Iran will have the ability, it has shown that it does have the ability to target oil infrastructure and gas infrastructure as well. So if that happens, we are again in uncharted territory, and it's going to be the rebound from what we're going through. And this war is going to take a lot of time. And again, the biggest up until this moment, as long as the Iranian regime in its current form persists or proves resilient in Tehran and continues to target the Gulf countries, they will be the biggest losers. And it depends on the kind of agreement that eventually will conclude this war, unfortunately.
Thanks, Bachar. Peter, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it depends on the perspective that you look at. Worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is, I guess, you could either look at it from a point of view of the US and Israel deciding to use tactical nukes potentially to hit Iran. That would be disastrous. You could maybe look at things from a perspective of if the conflict just was prolonged and went on for too long, what would the fallout be? You'd see energy markets collapsing. You'd see widespread blackouts potentially across lots of developed countries, raised commodity prices, potentially poverty increasing, lots of knock-on effects, lots of different things that could happen if, I think, yeah, obviously the longer this goes on, the worse it is. So is your worst case scenario that the conflict continues? Yes, it is. But is it also potentially very dangerous for the conflict to end with one fell swoop of a tactical nuclear strike? That's also a possibility. So, it's worst case isn't a nice case. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. It's not a nice case, and would have loved to finish on a more positive note on that. But with that said, I think we can continue for hours, maybe continue like talking about those, but I would like to stop here and thank you again for your time. And I know and I realize how like busy schedules you have now with everything happening. So thanks again from everyone in AUB as well. And also a big thanks to the AUB team who has helped and supported very short time to put this together. And we hope next time we convene that we can really say more positive things when it comes to the energy scene and the energy markets. So thanks very much, Bachar, Noam, Peter, and everyone for joining.
Thank
My
you. الله
pleasure.
يحمي
Thank
البلد.
you.
Thank you, Marc.
Thanks, guys.